We have a fairly streamlined agenda to cover one of the topics that came out of the last legislative session, even though, as we've acknowledged throughout this entire process, our work will be going on for quite a bit of time, and certainly been an interesting summer for housing, as it seems to have become kind of risen to the national stage in terms of political conversations and the crisis we're having around housing. And I think there was an article just this morning in News Junkie that I didn't get to read yet, but about rents increasing at some kind of dramatic rate. And obviously, as we've discovered in this group, the causes of that is multifaceted. It's not just one issue. But the topic today, I think, was something that's been on the minds of folks, is the design review process. Again, not because it's the sole contributor to what we're dealing with in terms of our housing access and housing affordability crisis, but one of those additional kind of barriers that we know exists in terms of being able to get more housing supply online for families and for the economic health of the state. So with us today, we have Cameron Rifkin from the National Conference of State Legislatures. He's a policy associate covering topics related to housing, homelessness, economic mobility, child support, family law. He's earned a master's degree in social work. I don't know from where, Cameron, and I was trying to find that detail out, but you can let us know when you come on board. But he's worked for various nonprofit organizations focusing on housing, environmental justice, food security, juvenile justice, and he has a presentation for us to review and listen to, talking about, one, the housing crisis we face, but two, more specifically, some questions around municipal design review. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Cameron and let him take it away.
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity. I grew up mostly in North Carolina, so my undergrad is from UNC Chapel Hill, and my master's program is from UNC Charlotte. So
at least it's not Duke, so that's good.
Yeah, okay, I'm glad. Hopefully there's no others on the I know we're in football season, so it's not quite basketball, so it's not as cutthroat for those schools maybe right now. My wife went to Alabama, so that's a little bit of a different story there. But yeah, I really appreciate Representative Rojas introducing me, and again, thank you all for allowing me to be here today and speak to you all at this meeting. I've joined you all maybe in the past, about a year or so ago, so there might be some familiar faces. But as Representative Rojas mentioned, my name's Cameron Rifkin. I'm at NCSL. I work on their Children and Families program, and my primarily focused on housing, homelessness, and economic mobility. So looking forward to jumping into this presentation. I think I should be able to share my screen. So let's see if that works. Can you all see this?
Yep.
Does that look? I hope you can. There we go.
Yeah, you're good to go.
There we go. Well, thank you again. Yeah, and I know we're here to talk about predominantly municipal design review. We'll talk a little bit about what this means in the larger picture of housing supply and housing challenges throughout the country. There's plenty of time for questions and answers at the end, so please feel free to bring those to the table afterwards. We can jump right in. So at a glance, our national housing crisis. On the supply side, there is a nationwide shortage of at least 1.5 million housing units. No state currently has a supply sufficient enough to address affordable housing needs. And there's a lack of adequate housing that affects both renters and homeowners. We've seen in previous markets that while housing construction was being built, even more expensive housing, that did create opportunities for low and middle income housing as those became more available. We're not seeing that in the current market. Vacancy rates are at historic lows. And part of this is because of construction challenges, rising material costs, lengthy permitting processes, construction workforce shortages, and restrictive zoning and regulations. I'd like to point out for lengthy permitting processes, there was a recent survey of developers. 97% of developers reported some sort of delay in the construction process. And of that 97%, 83% of them reported that it was because of permitting. So some demand side considerations. Home prices are currently jumped 47% since early 2020. And about 115% since 2010. This is not adjusted for inflation, so those percentages are slightly different. However, the total monthly payment of a median priced home is $3,000 and $3,096, so a little over $3,000. It's only affordable by 8% of Black households, 13% of Hispanic households, 16% of white households, and 29% of Asian American households. Cost burden households reached a record high in 2022. There's a few varying definitions, but overall cost burden usually refers to spending at least 30% or more on household costs, 30% of your income on household costs. So this is affecting nearly 1 in 4 homeowners and 1 in 2 renters. So it's clearly an issue across the board. A few recent trends in state housing policy to address this housing supply challenge: incentivizing more housing construction, expediting permitting processes, revising zoning regulations and permitting more density, updating and standardizing building codes, expanding transit-oriented development, preserving naturally existing affordable housing, and preventing displacement and strengthening eviction protections. We're going to dig into a few of these. I know there's more of a focus on this particular meeting, but I'd like to just highlight these as all levers being used to address affordable housing, accessible housing, and creating additional housing supply. Some barriers and opportunities. So housing construction barriers, I mentioned a little bit ago, rising construction and building material costs, workforce shortages, increased labor costs, the lengthy permitting processes, complicated administrative procedures, and minimum parking requirements. Parking requirements can significantly drive up costs for housing developers. Some studies show that in urban areas, structured or underground parking can cost as much as $25,000 to $65,000 per space. So that can certainly drive up costs for developers. It limits housing opportunities. It creates a larger footprint, on the land that doesn't involve housing units. But there are some opportunities for policymakers. Providing tax abatements and low-income housing tax credits to help stimulate housing supply. Offering financial incentives to developers to offset construction costs. This may come with a requirement that a portion of the project be reserved for income-restricted residents. Streamlining and simplifying permitting and administrative processes, and reducing or eliminating parking requirements. A few legislative examples I'd like to highlight regarding incentivizing and expediting housing construction. Alabama recently established the state workforce housing tax credit for qualified workforce housing projects. Guam created an affordable housing assistance fund and authorizes tax incentives for businesses that construct housing units. Maine created a comprehensive permitting process that allows for one single application to be submitted for the construction of affordable housing. And Pennsylvania permits local taxing authorities to provide tax exemptions for improvements to deteriorated areas and dwellings. This is with the aim to incentivize the creation and preservation of affordable housing. Part of this complex puzzle is building codes and design standards, which has, like everyone here, brought a lot of folks to the table and increased a lot of attention over the last couple legislative sessions. So some construction standards and building codes may be outdated or impose unnecessary requirements. There's also a lack of standardization across localities, and burdensome construction requirements can drive up costs. Examples include prohibiting prefabricating materials, requiring certain facade treatments, and restricting roofing products. I'd like to note that some of these might not increase health and safety and drive up costs regardless. So some opportunities: revising building codes to increase flexibility in construction and reducing costs while still ensuring safety. Allowing for prefabricated building components and permitting single stair design. Reducing requirements for costly materials, as well as standardizing or streamlining review processes. Several legislative examples. Arkansas prevents county and municipal governments from regulating building design elements. A few things go into building design elements. It's external materials, window placement, usually more aesthetic things that don't apply to health and safety. Louisiana actually created an income tax deduction for taxpayers who retrofit their residences and bring them into compliance with the State Uniform Construction Code. There's also eligible grants for taxpayers through Louisiana's Fortified Home Program. Texas, similar to Arkansas, prevents local governments from prohibiting the use of building materials, products, or construction methods as long as they are permitted in the National Model Code. Utah adopted a statewide building code for modular units, and they have a division in their state government that decides whether or not a modular unit is in compliance. And finally, Virginia requires the state's Board of Housing and Community Development to study whether it can safely allow a one staircase for 4 to 6-story buildings. As you can see, this is recent, so that study has not been published quite yet, but they are exploring various options to adopting their code. A lot of building code and standards often intersect with zoning, and that's a huge issue. Historically, zoning has been often left up to local governments, municipal and county governments. However, as this supply shortage persists, state governments, state policymakers have stepped in to address the need. So some barriers include zoning restrictions that prohibit housing other than single-family homes. Approximately 75% of land is zoned exclusively for single-family housing. This limits supply, it keeps prices high for renters, and it reduces homeownership opportunities. Some opportunities for policymakers, however, to address this include permitting a variety of property types, such as accessory dwelling units, middle housing, casitas, a few different types of manufactured housing. Also expanding transit-oriented development with housing specifically built near transit lines, creating housing options for all income levels, and leveraging high market demand from multiple generations of potential tenants and homebuyers. Recent studies have shown that baby boomer generations, folks would like to remain in their housing, remain independent, and age in place, and live in communities that have accessibility, while younger generations are interested in walkability, proximity to commerce centers. So there's definitely market demand from a wide range of folks, and bolstering economic mobility by connecting housing and employment. Some legislative examples about zoning updates. Maryland prohibits a local legislative body from restricting the placement of a manufactured home in a zoning district that allows for single-family residences. Montana recently enacted the Comprehensive Land Use Planning Act that offers a menu of housing initiatives municipalities must select from to increase housing supply and reduce housing costs. Things include reducing parking requirements, allowing for ADUs, a few other things that we've touched on. Rhode Island created procedures for the construction of low and moderate income housing. This includes zoning incentives local governments can offer to developers. And Washington requires cities to increase middle housing and permit more density in areas zoned for residential properties. I'd like to note that this legislation from Washington varies depending on the population size. To wrap up, a few NCSL resources. We have our comprehensive toolkit page that includes the rest of these resources listed. It's a nice central location for all of our housing and homelessness resources. Our legislation database, I update that weekly. It tracks quite a bit of legislation, several subtopic codes. Feel free to give it a look. You can sort by year, you can sort by enacted, you can sort by state. We also recently published a policy snapshot about increasing housing supply and reducing costs, and a webinar series that highlights a few of these topics, and we also discuss topics relevant to particular legislators. We met with some folks from across the country in Washington and Montana and a few other states. But yeah, please feel free to check those out when you get a chance. I'd like to invite everyone to Base Camp. That's our upcoming virtual event. There's going to be more information released. Registration will open soon. There's a webpage and all that good stuff. We'll make sure, hopefully, that you all can get these materials, these slides. But, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm always available. If it's not about this particular topic, I can certainly direct you in the way of NCSL resources or some other folks that might have more expertise. But here are the topics that Children and Families primarily covers, and as mentioned, housing, homelessness, economic security. Those are definitely my bread and butter. So would be eager to connect with you all. I'd be happy to answer any questions or concerns that you may have. But I really appreciate this opportunity, and thank you again. And I look forward to continuing this work with you all.
Thank you, Cameron. And we can certainly open it up for questions, but maybe I'll ask you to dig a little deeper into this whole municipal design review and trying to understand what it means when a municipality or a state prohibits a town or a county from enacting, any kind of limitations on design? What does that actually mean? Because I know, we hear from a lot of local leaders and folks who just live in their communities about this New England character and New England charms of our towns and cities, and therefore houses need to look like this. And if they don't, we're not going to maintain our New England historic charm. So what does it actually mean to limit design review? Do towns and communities suddenly have no say in that? Or does it significantly limit exactly the kind of restrictions they can put in place?
Yeah, Representative Rojas, I appreciate that. A big issue that this comes down to is the Dillon rule. And that kind of applies to a wide range. Most states are Dillon states. And how that plays out is it allows local governments, or doesn't allow local governments, to have explicit powers that weren't granted previously. And so often, as mentioned, local governments have had a lot of leeway and a lot of control over zoning, over a lot of housing issues, even rent stabilization policies. And so how this review process sort of plays out is when developers want to build properties, there's often many steps involved that gets that from the application process to actually being built, as you all probably are well aware of. And local governments have some say, depending on state and depending on policy, throughout this process. So California, for example, authorizes local governments to conduct design reviews or public oversight of housing developments. They don't always get the ultimate final say on whether or not it's built or not, but they often have some power of what gets built, where it gets built, what that building looks like, particularly in terms of density. As mentioned, building anything other than a single family home, a townhome, a duplex, not talking about high rises necessarily, but some level of density, cottage courts, that can be declined. They can say no. Again, depending on the leeway that's granted to these municipal governments. We worked with someone recently from Kentucky who mentioned that Kentucky, while not a huge state, has somewhere, I think, about 117 counties. And those counties have sort of flexibility, again, in their different processes of how they approve buildings, how they don't approve buildings. And so states have to work with local governments. This intergovernmental collaboration is key to get housing kind of over the finish line. And so states can purely, prohibit their authority, local government's authority, as I mentioned in a few of these legislative examples, as long as the building codes are up to, another standard, a state standard, a national standard, and often prohibit local governments from denying developments for seemingly not health, safety, public safety, concern for the community. Maybe they just have an issue with the type of property. They have an issue with the fact that the shingles will be made out of a certain material, or the color won't represent, sort of Representative Rojas, what you alluded to, a charm of a community. So it really plays out in state policymakers working with local governments to address this need that's pretty widespread. Local governments recently don't seem to have the resources, the backing to address these large scale supply shortages. And so states are coming in and saying, well, here are some options. It's a mixture of a carrot and a stick, but you have to start allowing certain properties. You can't just say no because it's a duplex or something along those lines. Does that sort of answer your initial question?
Yeah, no, I'm looking like at the Arkansas one is the one that stood out the most,
Yeah.
right, as the example. And it's always interesting to go to other state legislatures and see how they have information on their website. I would say none is better than Connecticut's.
Yeah.
Because I was looking for a plain language summary of that Senate Bill 170, and I can't quite find it, but the bill is up.
Okay.
Just trying to understand exactly what it is that Arkansas did under that bill. Like, did they just say towns no longer can engage in municipal design review, and is Arkansas Dillon state or not?
Yeah, I'd be happy to follow that up. I don't have the map immediately on hand. My understanding is that most states are Dillon states. I think somewhere in the 37 states, um, 39 maybe. So I can definitely see what specific mechanisms I'm guessing. That's a little bit of a guess. There's always strategies to reduce funding, withhold funding from local and city governments. States have explored that. In a variety of housing things. Again, that kind of comes back to rent stabilization and other zoning issues. So there's always that carrot versus a stick option. Um, but I would be happy to dig in a little bit more into this Arkansas one about what I guess enforcement mechanisms sort of look like. Um, I'm thinking that maybe they open up some avenues for an appeal process. If some city or county denies uh, a particular property, there's avenues to supersede that. But I'd be happy to dig into that one in particular if there are heavy interest or more questions about that particular legislation.
Yeah, and I see Francis has his hand raised, so he might have a comment and or info on that.
Yeah, thank you. Audible, I'm on a bad connection. Um, can you hear me, Jason?
Yep, you're good. Yep.
Yep. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Cameron. Yeah, I would be curious about the Arkansas example. We've been looking at this issue of design review here in Connecticut, and municipalities in Connecticut have two options. Statewide, a municipality can have an advisory design or architectural review anywhere in town, but that's completely voluntary on the part of an applicant. A mandatory design review can only be exercised in a state historic district or a village district. And our estimates are that under 1% of the area of Connecticut has a state historic district or village district with mandatory design review in place. So this is really a very small fraction of the land in the state and of the housing stock. What I would be curious is whether in Arkansas, there were also in this law, they were also getting rid of historic preservation, because we all know that's one, protecting our cultural history is a huge part of being New England. And I would be surprised if Arkansas didn't want to protect their history as well.
It does not apply to historic districts.
In Arkansas? Oh, in Arkansas?
Yeah, for whatever reason, I can't find the share of something in the chat, even though I've used Zoom a million times, but I was going to share the law. It's only 2 pages, but there is an exemption for historic districts, and just reading it quickly.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Representative Ross and Mr. Pickering, thank you for adding that context. I really appreciate particularly how this nuance sort of plays out in Connecticut with the review process. Similarly, there are additional resources I can share. I don't seem to have a chat functionality either.
All right, it's not just you.
So
okay.
We can certainly follow up. There is a the National Association of Home Builders dug into this Arkansas bill along with some other legislation. So I can certainly, it's a PDF. So I can certainly share that as well.
Okay, Cameron, maybe you can expand upon it. So, this design process, and Francis said it's mandatory in some places, an option in others, and it'd be interesting to know how many communities, local boards avail themselves of that option to put developers or proposals through that kind of design review process. But can you articulate how it contributes to the cost? I mean, I think that's the biggest barrier that it's probably contributing to. But I mean, I think it's time and money, but often they're one and the same. So.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah. So this one in Arkansas, my understanding is that this legislation was born out of a particular issue in a community in Arkansas. A city council proposed changes that were going to start requiring certain materials, prohibiting vinyl, wood, aluminum, certain siding materials, roof pitches, even I think front-facing garages. And so when you add these burdensome requirements, it de-incentivizes developers from building. It adds additional costs. It creates sort of just additional administrative barriers that dissuade, frankly, developers from going down that route. That ultimately it has to be financially viable. I think on average, it showed that an apartment building takes about 18 months to build. And that's, not a huge, again, not huge apartment and skyrise buildings. So when you add just additional requirements or prohibitions on you can't use this, you can't have prefabricated materials in case it wasn't, prefabricated materials are built elsewhere and then brought to a housing site to be sort of constructed together like a puzzle. It can also apply to manufactured housing and things like that. So when you limit that, it just creates less opportunity. It limits the types of properties. It limits the materials you can use. It limits the sources of materials. If you're requiring you use one particular material or several, you can't go to certain providers. You can't, so yeah, I think just creating additional barriers that don't add to health and safety. I'd like to, comment on, that there are updates and revisions happening to national codes, review processes happening to update standards to make sure that buildings are health and safety compliant. You have to take into consideration fire, single stair. Sorry, just to highlight that, a big issue is the fire code. Firefighters and that group of organizations are not always thrilled about single stair, even though historically buildings centuries ago were built like this. You have to have accessibility concerns. If you're not going to have an elevator, you have to, folks with mobility issues might need to be reserved for the first floor if you only have one stair. So there's just additional cost, additional time, additional burdens that are added if you begin to sort of allow local governments to decide whatever they want. Again, material types, if it's just driving up costs, then that might be something to look at, as opposed to the goal is to improve community well-being. There are how far out does the sidewalk need to be? And that, those things, on-site parking, we talked about parking requirements. So those are all worthwhile conversations to address housing needs. But if if you're just creating obstacles for developers or folks, then that, continues to limit opportunity.
I had some more thoughts, but I want to allow others to chime in. Senator Duff, followed by Pat Giuliano.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Cameron, for being back here again. I appreciate it. And I think the stats nationwide are really just staggering, and it shows that it's not just an issue in Connecticut, but that's obviously very cold comfort to people who need housing here in this state, which is, why I'm glad that we continue to focus on this issue. Frankly, I was in a foreign country earlier this year, and one that's not very well populated, but they were talking about the need for affordable housing. So while it's a nationwide issue, I also think it's probably a worldwide issue as well. But, we're tasked to focus and act on areas in our corner of the world where we can actually have some, make a difference and have some effect. So I guess my question to you is, are you tracking on these laws? Do you also track, or is there a way to track whether or not housing, some of these laws are helping to actually build housing or not, or what's most effective, what's not been effective? I mean, every state's different, so what's effective in one state may not be effective in another state, but there's got to be some sort of common theme. There's a common problem. So there's got to be, at least some sort of common solutions, and then you can tinker it to what works best in your state. But just trying to figure out, what, not that there's a secret sauce or magic formula or magic wand, but there's got to be some things that are actually working to help to build the most housing the fastest.
Senator Duffy, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's definitely not a one size fits all. What might work in Arkansas might not work in Connecticut. What might work in Washington might not work in Kentucky. I will say that Pew Research Center has quite a bit of data that I can certainly share with you all. Ultimately, what they have found, they studied a bunch of cities. It's more on local levels than state levels, but they geographically and politically covered quite a wide spectrum. Ultimately, what they found is that places that were able to build more housing kept rents lower and created more homeownership opportunities. How to build more housing, that was a debate depending on where you were from. Some of it was offering tax incentives to developers, expanding state level low income housing tax credits, changing zoning regulations. Montana's land use was a pretty big deal for their state legislature. They had requirements on lot sizes for many times, and they started trying to trim down on that to increase density, and not, they had an issue of going into agricultural and rural land, and they wanted to kind of preserve their natural beauty in Montana. And so when they were allowing huge lot sizes or requiring huge lot sizes, they were running into some issues. So I'd be happy to share Pew, I think some other Moody's, even National Association of Home Builders has some information. But ultimately, there seems to be a consensus that supply is the biggest issue, that there simply is just not enough housing. It's not keeping up with the pace of demand, is really that bigger issue, is that we are building, but we're not building to keep up with folks. So yeah, I mean, there's a few ways to address it. Maine, I alluded to Maine.
Can I ask you one other, can I just interrupt there real quick?
Please. I'm not sure.
I'm sorry, you were in and out. Yeah,
Sorry.
you're skipping a little bit. I think it's either on my end or your end, but the question I guess I had was just on that vein of supply. My other job has been in real estate for about 28 years, residential real estate, and there's always the kind of the boom and the bust of supply and demand. But as you said, since 2020, prices have gone up about 46%. I think that's the number you said. That's huge, and that's unprecedented as far as I know in my 28 years in the industry. And because of various policies we have, I won't get into all the stuff, but I'm not sure that there's prices may come down at some point because the market cools or something, there's a recession or something else happens at some point in the future. But I still think the demand is still going to be there for more housing. So because there's people who say, well, you build all this housing, then there's a boom, and then there's the bust, and then you have all this housing there. But I think that there's still the need for, still going to be well into the future, a greater need for housing, however the real estate cycle goes. And maybe even our housing commissioner or head of CHAFA can talk about this too, but I just want to see if you had any thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, places such as like Washington, I think recently put out a study that said they have to build somewhere around 50,000 affordable units annually in order to keep up with their growth in their particular state. I think a key is allowing for different properties. I think tackling this one home at a time is not feasible. And so there was another highlight. I mean, in the Pew Research data, I think they highlighted Tyson's Corner, Virginia. They highlighted perhaps Houston, and a few other places where they adjusted zoning to allow for more properties, different zoning to allow for dense properties. They incentivized developers to build. They made it easier for developers to build, similar to Maine. They created a streamlined process to apply, to go through all sorts of the safety and code and all that through one avenue. So I think ultimately that's kind of where some of the data supports the idea that building more is the key to addressing the prices, particularly. I mean, that demand is high and supply is limited, so folks can sort of charge what they want to charge for rental prices, especially in large growing urban areas. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it on our end, I think, is that building more results in lower costs and more opportunities.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Duff.
I appreciate it. And Andy, did you want to jump? You're leaning forward, so I'm not sure if you want to jump in on that.
Sure. I'll chime in really quickly to say that I think that the shortage that Connecticut is currently experiencing is somewhere in the range of 90,000 units. And we're not going to get to that number purely by building. I think it's going to be a combination of different strategies, including there are other ways that you can start to meet that gap, whether it's rental assistance or other strategies that are needed for lower income households to be able to afford housing, but certainly meeting it through supply is something that is absolutely needed. Even though Connecticut has not grown its population significantly, I think it has a little bit during the pandemic. What has really created a demand surge is household formation has increased significantly and is expected to increase over the next several years. And so even though we may feel that building a lot is eventually going to catch up, we're going to need that going forward as Connecticut ages and demographically, Generation Z and others start to form their own households and will need units to meet that demand.
No, that's great. I appreciate that insight and context. Yeah, I mean, this is just a very large, complicated puzzle that requires a lot of different strategies. And so I think I alluded to it before, but preventing displacement, keeping folks where they are will certainly help address this housing challenges, because if folks can remain in their current housing, then they won't be in the market for new housing. And we can get folks that are actually in the need of housing into those places. So things like first-time home buyer programs to help build equity, and things like right to counsel, or again, just various eviction protections can certainly help folks remain in their household. I think that Louisiana, there's a few others to incentivize homeowners to retrofit their properties or repair their properties to kind of preserve this naturally occurring affordable housing. So I appreciate that insight and that view.
If I can just add, since Senator Duff mentioned me too, I just add one more to what Anthony mentioned on the, I think it's 90,000, 98,000, that the study that we did about 3 or 4 years ago mentioned that people were paying more than 50% of their income. So it's not really 98,000 units that we needed, but 98,000 families or households or individuals are paying more than they are making. So that we need to, yes, we need to build more housing. We need to provide more subsidy for some of those households, but also the fact that investors are buying multifamily and displacing people because the rent goes so high. So we can't forget that too. Not only, it's not just one investor, we get multiple calls every day that an investor has bought people's properties, apartments, and that they are increasing the rent more than 20, 30%, and sometimes 50%. So that is gonna, if we don't do something about it, also it's gonna continue, because no matter how much money or how much housing we build, the ones that we have and the renters that we have right now, they're gonna be displaced because of the investors coming in and buying these properties.
Thank you for that additional context. Yes, I wasn't sure exactly how much to cover in this brief presentation. We have a good bit of material on investor purchases and the intersection of short-term rentals. We've seen a dramatic increase of short-term rentals as well, which can limit, obviously, home ownership opportunities, particularly for new families, first-time home buyers, new families. I'd be happy to share additional information about that. the number of mega investors, which is folks who own, or folks, companies that own 1,000 properties or more, which is a pretty large threshold. It's about 3% of all single-family rental properties. It was at a peak in the summer of 2022, and it's decreased a little. But I think according to some studies, investors have purchased 25% of single-family homes each year since 2021. And so that has persisted even with mortgage rates remaining fairly high. So would be happy to share some more information about how all that intersects and plays into this as well. So
And any legislations that other states have done to prevent?
Yeah. It's very new. I will say I've seen more introduced legislation than enacted legislation. But Colorado does authorize county board of commissioners to license and regulate short-term lodging rentals. Short-term is anything 30 days or less. Some introduced legislation is pretty unique. Illinois introduced some legislation that would impose a tax on partnerships, LLCs, investment trusts on single-family residences. Minnesota introduced legislation to entirely prohibit corporate entities, developers, and contractors from converting single-family homes into short-term rentals. So there's quite a bit of legislation that's been introduced. I think Indiana had a pretty robust one. It failed to pass the state legislature. States like Hawaii have introduced legislation to add extra taxes or fees on second home purchases or vacation home purchases, like eliminate the home mortgage deduction for vacation homes. So there's been some legislation in that realm as well. So I'd be happy to follow up with a more kind of thorough report about that particular topic, because that is certainly a key component to this as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we are getting to Pat Giuliano.
Thank you. I'm Pat Giuliano. I'm with the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority as well. Cameron, I want to just go back to a couple of things. When you spoke about legislation that would take away some of the restrictions that localities are imposing, you mentioned that you saw a trend to move these down to like health and safety issues. Are you saying that they're also moving away from like resiliency and sustainability measures, energy conservation measures, or is it just because in Connecticut, what I'm seeing is that the additional aesthetics that are required are a small portion of the additional costs on the development of affordable projects. The larger costs come in both the financing costs, which there are a lot of with tax credits, and then we have a lot of resiliency and sustainability measures. Do you see any movement away from those requirements?
Yeah, thank you for that. I will say that there's been legislation regarding the construction of affordable housing developments to exclude them from certain environmental review standard processes, or at least reduce those barriers. I can definitely find that particular legislation. Those nitty-gritty details are escaping me at the moment, but there has been legislation to incentivize developers to build construction by reducing some of those administrative barriers, including certain, environmental requirements. I don't think that means throwing them out the window entirely, but I do think it means being more flexible, maybe streamlining that process in some way or another, because that has seemingly been a barrier for a lot of developers. There's also, this might not entirely answer your question, this goes a little bit more into HOAs than it does like county governments, but there has been a lot of legislation to reduce HOA authority from restrictions and prohibitions for solar panels, certain for environmentally friendly landscaping. There's often been a lot of power that HOAs have about limiting what homeowners can do. And so there has been legislation that way to kind of give homeowners more flexibility and authority over their own home, to improve environmental stuff, that way. So I'd be happy to follow up with that as well. There has been on large scale some legislation to loosen environmental standards or review processes for particularly affordable housing development. And when I say affordable housing, sometimes that term gets kind of muddled around. In this particular case, I mean income restricted housing eligible for vouchers, eligible for folks with incomes below a certain level. So I know affordable kind of sometimes means different things, but that particular type of development. So I can certainly look into that and send you some examples.
Okay. And then sort of in the same vein, you mentioned parking a couple of times, reducing parking restrictions. And we've had a lot of discussion about that over the past, especially over the past, say, 6 months with projects that we see primarily in urban environments. Are you seeing, so you said the removal of restrictions, but are you seeing the trend to be the removal of parking from these, like completely, like no assigned parking, no parking lots, no parking structures?
There have been a wide range of attempts. I will say that I think one of the more out there, if you will, pieces of legislation, I'm not remembering what state it was from, would allow sort of parking alternatives. And I think that even meant off-site parking. That meant a building could even come into some sort of agreement with like a ride share program or shuttle service. But there has been a big push towards transit-oriented development. A shameless plug, my colleague Doug and I, he's the associate director of the transportation team. We recorded a podcast recently to discuss predominantly transit-oriented development and the intersection of this. And so those particular properties tend to have less parking requirements if you're built on a transit line, bus line, subways, light rail. I know Connecticut kind of varies, depending on how close to maybe New York City you get of what level of transportation is out there. States like Montana that don't really have big public transit, it's more commerce-oriented development. So building housing specifically near like main streets or commerce centers, which might not have that transit line, but still has that economic component of keeping folks where their job is, healthcare, food services, all that. So there have been, like in that Montana rule, that was one. They basically offered localities a menu of options. They said you have to pick X number of these. We give you 12 options, pick like 3 of them. I don't know exactly what the requirement is, but it's something along those lines. And one of them was reducing parking requirements, reducing the number of on street, reducing the blueprint of the building itself. Offering some sort of alternative because, as mentioned, it's just developers don't really like building parking requirements from the surveys that I've seen, because that's not a housing unit that you can therefore charge rent on after the fact. So that's not really financially viable for most folks. I know parking does cost money and honestly very expensive at times, but nowhere near the level of a housing unit of rent. And so, yes, there has been, recently, particularly a lot of parking requirement legislation. Let me see if I can offhand.
So Cameron, more towards moderating the requirements than eliminating, or more towards eliminating than moderating?
It's a mixture. So Nevada recently passed legislation to allow municipalities to establish policies that don't require. So it's sort of like flexibility of allowing municipalities to do what they can. Utah has a pretty robust housing and transit reinvestment zone. It's almost updated every year, to be honest. So there's several pieces of legislation. They recently passed proposals to include housing plans to improve efficiencies in parking and walkability. Oregon prohibits municipalities from requiring that driveways, vehicle access, parking, or minimum street frontage be included in the development application. So you can't require a developer to say, this is where we're going to put parking like that. Colorado provides grants and financial assistance to local governments to encourage affordable housing strategies, which means including reducing parking requirements. So they actually offer financial incentives to local governments to figure out where housing can go and it doesn't need all these large parking spaces. So yes, that is also, I know that was a little long-winded, but it's a mixture of allowing municipalities to, again, it's kind of this combo of carrot and a stick. And some have taken more strong positions of just disallowing local power over some of these, zoning and regulations.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Francis, and then Rebecca. Augur.
Yeah, thanks again, Cameron. A comment and two questions. I appreciate your mention of HOAs. We often forget here in Connecticut that much of the rest of the country, the development style is HOA centric, and the HOAs can impose rules that can be extremely confining and cost drivers. And so it's important to look at how we stack up HOA plus municipality plus county plus state to see what the overall regulatory impact is and not look at it in isolation, because different states put different things at different levels. Two questions. One is, when it comes to design review, there's a difference between having clearly articulated standards that an applicant knows what they are in advance, and versus having a process that's much more discretionary. And then the actual costs that those standards create, right? So the standards themselves could be onerous, but it could also be a process that is unpredictable. Do you see any patterns across the country in moving towards maybe a more predictable design process? I know there's been a lot of conversation about form-based codes, which, from my perspective, are design review by another name. It's just everything's presented more upfront.
Yeah, that's a great point, and thank you for highlighting the HOAs as well. Because we know this is just a level of state, federal, local, municipal government issue. To answer your question, that might need a little bit additional follow-up and digging. Can you remind me? Just rephrase that again one more time. I had some talking points.
So I mean, when we're talking, so I guess my point is, a municipality or an HOA could set standards that are very expensive to comply with because they say, your siding must have 18-karat gold gilding, right? You could do that. You could also say, our standards are they're pretty easy to comply with, but then you get ping pong between commissions for 18 months.
Sure. Yeah. So similar. I can find some more examples. Maine is one of those. There have been states to just streamline this process and almost make it like a one-stop shop. Because as you mentioned, it's a lot of like, oh, well, now we have to go to like the environmental folks, and then we have to go to the wastewater folks, and then we have to go to the land zoning folks. And then, so it can be very, like you said, onerous to go between all these folks. So there have been definitely legislative policies to streamline, to simplify, to just make it overall easier to build, because as mentioned, time is money, and delaying these projects is not financially viable for developers. And so yes is the short answer. There are I'm thinking of a few examples. Rhode Island created like its own distinct judicial calendar for administrative and like land use matters. So instead of having to go through another court or another sort of review process, they created its own separate judicial calendar to reduce delays in the development permitting process. Texas passed some legislation last year that's pretty unique. I am curious to know, similarly, Rep. Rojas, about how it sort of plays out in enforcement. But Texas passed some legislation that requires jurisdictions to act within 15 days of receiving a development application document. That might not mean approve or deny, it might, a step in the process, but act within 15 days. If they fail to do so, landowners are permitted to basically seek out a licensed third party to complete any sort of permitting or inspection process that was delayed because the local government did not act.
Yeah, what I
that
heard
is
from
sorry, yeah, I was just
Yeah.
going to give you the number. It's HB 14, and it's 2023. But again, I can send all of this information out. A lot of this is on that snapshot that I mentioned and some other stuff. But yeah, is that sort of in the
Well,
realm?
It is what I hear from developers. It's not so much necessarily the cost of the standards. It's more, we just want certainty. Tell us what you're going to require of
Right.
us in the design review process, and we will build to that. But if we don't know because you haven't made up your mind in advance and you're not clear about it, then that causes delays and cost and lots of change orders to site plans and whatnot.
Sure.
My other question, if I may, was and Connecticut, the Northeast is a slow/no growth area in terms of population. The growth in households we're seeing is because our households are shrinking. They continue to shrink. And so if we're building more housing for a relatively constant number of people, it's really hard to make that work out such that we don't have a growing debt burden. More square footage per person means more to pay for. And I wonder, are there any places in the country that have found a way to help facilitate the reutilization of underutilized large single family homes or underutilized commercial spaces? Because buildings that are already standing are often cheaper to renovate than build from scratch, especially given today's financing and construction costs.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point. And we didn't touch on it entirely. But yes, the preservation of naturally occurring affordable housing, I think NOAH is sometimes an acronym that you may run into, NOAH. So there's a few points to that question. There are programs to incentivize low-income homeowners to retrofit or there's a word I'm thinking of that I'm totally blanking on, but basically bring it into more environmentally friendly, updating the duct systems, making sure the ventilation is working, reducing attic flow, and the doors are all friendly to that to reduce utility costs. So there are programs to incentivize homeowners to do those sorts of programs to their homes. For the adaptive reuse of commercial space, it's a bit tricky. I have definitely seen states exploring that. I think New York passed some legislation to do a study or a task force. The data seems to suggest that adaptive reuse of commercial spaces is very costly. These buildings aren't built for homes or residences, so the plumbing infrastructure is a bit tricky if you have, centrally located bathrooms in the middle of a building. If you don't have windows or fire escapes or egresses, you can't really just like turn a cubicle into a bedroom. However, Washington and maybe even Oregon, some stuff on the West Coast, is exploring sort of various terms, social living. It's almost like dormitory style housing. And they are exploring the adaptive reuse of commercial spaces for that, because a shared bathroom on a floor or on a wing of a building for 4 units is potentially feasible and worthwhile financially, to rather than have this unit sit empty or demolish it and start over. So there is some movement in that realm. There are states still exploring and cities still exploring, even here in Colorado, the adaptive reuse. I mean, I think Denver has one of the lowest office occupancy rates for metro areas. So there's still folks exploring that. I think a lot of the data suggests that it's very costly to transform these large commercial buildings into homes. However, like I said, there are some innovative ideas to see how we can use that space for housing, for supportive services, for something that benefits this issue and these communities. Weatherization. I'm so sorry. That was the word I was missing. The weatherization of people's homes is definitely, particularly in the Southeast and folks susceptible to climate disasters. There are programs similar to that Homes Fortify program. That's a nationwide thing, to incentivize folks to improve the condition of their older homes, somewhat dilapidated.
Yeah, but Cameron, I guess what I'm getting at is we have a lot of large single family homes, and historically, we had back in the middle of the last century, Victorian homes were often carved up into apartments. And that, as far as I know, was done without government support. That was, cost effective. And we're seeing that situation again where you have many large single family homes with few residents. Now, not everybody's going to want to convert their home into a duplex, triplex, or quadplex. But the existing systems could probably handle the additional occupant load. We wouldn't be adding bedrooms, just reconfiguring. And has any state been doing that with single family homes?
I'm not thinking of any immediately off the top of my head, unfortunately. I'd have to dig a little bit deeper. That does, I think, unfortunately play into some of this zoning stuff. There's also infrastructure concerns. I know you mentioned you're not increasing the number of bedrooms, but if there are more people, then sometimes, again, the plumbing, the wastewater, the other infrastructure needed to address this load of humans can be sort of burdensome for developers and local communities as well. So I'd love to dig into that a little bit more in terms of like the conversion of single family homes into multi-unit properties. So that's a very interesting point. I definitely not on the state level. Nothing is ringing a bell, but I can certainly dig in deeper to that.
All right, thank you, Francis and Cameron. Rebecca.
Thank you. I was just going to pick up on a couple of things that Francis just talked about. So in Connecticut, my familiarity with design standards and design review, I think, as Francis said before, there's two options that may be debatable whether there are two options. We are a Dillon rule state. So our zoning, it's clear that we can have design standards for our village districts and historic districts. I'm not so sure how clear it is that it can exist outside of those areas, but it does nevertheless. And I agree that design standards in and of themselves are not necessarily problematic. As I see them in Connecticut, they're often around massing, roof lines, fenestration, facade treatments, that sort of thing. It's frequently the process that gets associated with the design standards that becomes problematic. And so I'm wondering, in some of these states that have taken initiatives to limit design review, what kind of study did they do to understand how design standards are being implemented before they enacted that legislation? And then a second portion, Francis mentioned form-based codes, and I also agree that that's sort of a flip side of design review. And I know that there are several cities around the country that have developed pre-approved plans for accessory dwelling units. And I think I'm starting to see maybe some middle housing units with pre-approved plans. To me, that's sort of an inverse design review sort of issue. So I'm wondering what initiatives are happening on that side of things with form-based codes or pre-approved plans.
Yeah, that's a great question. That is something I'm not super familiar with, unfortunately. I mean, there's definitely been zoning updates to allow for these types of properties and administrative improvements to allow for these, but in terms of pre-approved building, I am not as familiar with that, at least at the state level, of what they would allow local governments to allow for. Would you mind talking a little bit more about that? I mean, what pre-approved how, I guess?
Yeah, so it's all I've seen really have been for accessory dwelling units, and it's been at a city level, although I think I might have seen a county level as well, where they have, 4 or 5 sets of plans that are pre-approved. So if you come in and say, I want to build an accessory dwelling unit and I can do this plan and it fits on my site, you have to demonstrate just your site compliance, basically.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's permitted. And I don't know, that's clearly difficult to do at a statewide scale, but I'm just wondering if you're seeing any county level or other initiatives around something like that.
Okay. There is, so this kind of intersects with a terminology that I'm a little familiar with called by right. I don't know if that rings any bells, but there is sort of this by right approval when if it conforms to zoning and building, it qualifies for construction without discretionary approval. So there's definitely that included in that Montana land use bill that I mentioned. There's definitely language that mentions you have to allow these properties by right. I think you are correct in the assumption that these might be particularly geared towards ADUs. And so, yes, maybe that's where this is just a terminology thing. So I'd be happy to dig a little bit into that. We definitely have some examples about by right zoning, and other things of that nature. I'm trying to think, there's some other West Coast stuff that was coming to mind, but Montana definitely uses that language. And a few others, maybe even Minnesota. We just worked with some folks with Minnesota. So I would be happy to follow up with some information about that.
Yeah, I'm thinking more. I know I've seen several California cities. I've seen it elsewhere, where they actually have literal drawing plans for units that are pre-approved by the city. And so if you come in with that plan, you just demonstrate site compliance and you're good to go, you're permitted.
It's very interesting. Yes, we can certainly see what I can find in that topic. I appreciate you sharing that. That's another piece to this puzzle.
Cameron, you have a lot of homework, follow-up homework from.
Yes, and I apologize that I don't.
That's what happened with you joining us.
I will be gladly to, share all the resources and materials we have and additional reports, and I'll hit the ground running. So no worries.
We appreciate it. Dave, go ahead. Dave McCarthy.
All right. Thanks for the discussion today. What I wanted to add is a paper I read recently by Ed Glazer, who's a housing economist. He's fairly well known in that field, and in the paper he seeks to sort of tie together two different trends. One of them being increased land regulation since 1950. And the other one being that housing continues to rise, CPI adjusted, as the construction of housing continues to rise in the CPI adjusted, whereas the purchase of almost any other product has dropped CPI adjusted since 1950. And the paper, I thought, made an interesting case that, essentially the way that these two trends are connected, the way their theory at least, is that land regulation causes construction to be built in very small nuggets that essentially drive down the size of firms that can build in any particular market. That unlike in virtually any other product in today's world, construction companies and development companies like mine, for example, are very small, usually under 100 employees. Whereas, you look at like cars or washing machines or anything else that's a commodity product is produced usually by a few very large companies that employ tens of thousands of people. And they argue that the reason in construction has not gone that direction and why it continues to become more and more expensive is because of land use regulation. So I think it's an interesting theory to consider because it argues that not only should land regulation be more lenient, but also that land regulation should create opportunities for large projects that could be built at scale. not necessarily like allowing more ADUs, but actually allowing, 1,500, 2,000 unit developments might be one way to drive down the cost of construction. It's worth considering, at least.
No, that's a really important part of this. That's a great insight. Yes, you kind of hit the nail on the head there. I appreciate Ed Glazer's definitely well known and respected in this world. I will say that just from research and sort of doing these presentations, that you tend to run into a little bit more of what some folks might call the NIMBYism, the bigger the property is.
Sure.
So people might be more inclined to allow these ADUs or townhomes or duplexes than saying, hey, we got this empty lot, we're going to build a 12-story building on it. While that does put a larger dent into the housing supply shortage and addresses those needs. And as mentioned before, even in previous markets, even if those apartment units were fairly high cost, previous markets, that created other opportunities if those people moved into those, that their previous property would become available, 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years. We're just not seeing that in this market. The vacancy rates are just historically low. But that is a great point to say that, we doing this sort of piecemeal strategy doesn't always address the large scale. And someone mentioned it, what 90,000 units that you might need in your state. If Hartford builds 8, it's like, all right, that's something, but might not be what we needed. So yes, I would just like to caution, sometimes it does seem to attract more of that local attention and local desire to get involved in the process when you build these large scale things, or if you sometimes, like I said, that term affordable housing gets into people's heads and that kind of deters folks. We don't want that type of housing. But yes, that's a really great point about how zoning limits opportunities for these large scale developers, which it adds to the supply challenge. So thank you. I appreciate that. Can definitely, again, send you some more resources that cover this topic as well.
Thanks, Dave. Were you done, Dave?
I'm all.
Yeah, you're all set. Any other, don't see any active hands raised. Any other questions or comments from folks? And was not expecting us to solve municipal design review questions in this one meeting, of course. But I think it's been a great conversation. This is what I get most out of these meetings, is just listening to really smart people talk about housing issues and being able to pick up on those notes and trying to put something together that helps move the needle in the direction that at least I'm trying to get to. I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think all of us are trying to get to, but me in particular. And I know Senator Duff just unmuted himself, so he might have a comment.
No, I just wasn't sure if we were wrapping up or not, but no, I appreciate all the information. It's really great. Jason.
Yeah, no, other than Cameron's very big homework assignment to get us information, if there's no other folks who have questions or comments, we can certainly wrap up and give everybody 14 minutes back on a Monday. Cameron.
I just wanted to say thank you again. I really appreciate this, and thank you for the really thoughtful conversations and robust questions. Like I said, I apologize I didn't have some of this immediately available. I would be happy to follow up with you all. And Representative Rojas, just like you said, I love hearing from you all. Your own personal experiences in this development world and housing world, and it all seems like you all bring something to the table in this realm. So hearing from your perspective and insight is very valuable and helps us with our research and produce our resources and want it to be beneficial for you all. So just wanted to say thank you again. I really do appreciate this opportunity.
Yeah, no, it's helpful to, I often like to say we're parochial to a fault here in Connecticut, but helpful to have that national perspective, but also see there's things happening in red states that are not happening in blue states, and there's things happening in blue states that are happening in red states, and then there's a bunch of purple states muddling along. So there is an answer out there that I think can help all of us figure out exactly how we move the needle here in Connecticut, but it's somewhat comforting to know we're not alone in this. But at the same time, we all have a pretty important responsibility to try to do something on this, because as I've said over and over again, we're kind of in this housing bubble space, weird place, lack of supply, really expensive. I am concerned about Connecticut 10 years from now. Maybe with climate going on, we'll have people moving back, deciding to move back when you can't get your home insured in Florida or you run out of water in Arizona. And I think we need to be prepared for that. But it's also recognizing that Connecticut has a lot of old housing stock that needs to be replaced. So it's not just about population growth, about meeting the needs of people who live here today, and will live here 10 or 15 years from now. So I will appreciate everybody's continued engagement on this, and look forward to connecting with you guys over the next couple months on when we're all officially back to work once Labor Day passes. So even though we're all at work.
Thanks, everybody.
So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.